Hello and welcome to this very special live stream for Iconicon. I'm Conrad, one of the hosts of Movie Oubliette, the podcast where we talk about forgotten fantastical films. My co-host Dan is tucked up in bed, of course, in Australia. So I am very lucky to be joined today by Melinda from RetroBlasting. Hello, Melinda.
Hello, Conrad. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so glad to have you here. And excitingly, for the very first time, I am also going to be sharing the screen with Serge of Cold Crash Pictures. Hello, Serge.
Hi, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
Serge.
It's very exciting to have you here. But even more exciting, we are joined by the director of the landmark horror film that we are here to talk about today, celebrating its 30th anniversary, Candyman. He started his career working for Jim Henson on The Muppet Show and The Dark Crystal, directed music videos, including the very first banned video for Relax by Frankie Goes to Hollywood, and has since built an incredible career as a filmmaker, working on projects as diverse as Immortal Beloved, Samurai Marathon, and of course, Candyman. We are very lucky to be joined by Bernard Rose. Hello, sir.
Hello, how are you?
Very well. I'm so glad to speak to you. How are you doing today?
Well, pretty good.
Pretty good. Okay, well, unbelievably, it's 30 years since Candyman debuted. I want to wind you right the way back to the beginning and ask you about what attracted you to the prospect of adopting Clive Barker's short story, The Forbidden, because I believe it was you who pitched the project to Propaganda Films in the first place.
Yeah, no, that's correct. I did. I mean, I suppose the short answer is I thought it would make a good movie, which is a kind of a... I mean, often it doesn't really come down to much more than that. And I also thought that they might buy it, which they did. And I think I needed a job that week. So I don't think it was anything particularly more complicated than that. I just really liked what I liked about Clive's story was the central premise that, you know, you might have a monster or a god or something that people believed in or feared, but that if the fear and the belief were somehow to lessen and dissipate, the monster or the god would have a small window of opportunity to regenerate the belief in him and somehow not disappear. I think, you know, it's the idea that, you know, the Roman gods all disappeared, you know, the Greek gods all disappeared into Roman gods. And, you know, and if you stopped, humans love gods, but, you know, if they don't have that enough sort of collective unconsciousness attention focused on them, they might lose their energy, you know?
So how much awareness do you think that Neil Gaiman has that he completely took that idea into American Gods?
Well, I think Neil has spent his life ripping me off. He also ripped off my house with a rather dull film called Mirror Mask.
Yes.
Which was ripped off, I think, beat for beat. But that's Neil. No. I've never read one of his books because they're for children, right? I honestly don't know much about Neil Gaiman, but I didn't know that. I've never heard that. But you're not the first person that said that Neil's ripped me off. You know, I actually don't think ripping something off is a sin at all. I think that if you make something up out of thin air, it probably has no relationship to anything or any idea. I'm sure Clive ripped that idea off. You know?
Yeah, it could be that Neil either subconsciously or consciously appreciated that idea, but it's very, very much so in the novel and even in the TV show. It's, you know, these gods who are drawing from people believing in them, and that is what, like, if people stop believing in them, they literally cease to exist. And so that's exactly what's happening in Candyman. So
yeah, I mean, it's absolutely that's Clive's concept. So maybe Clive, I mean, I was told by some people to sue Neil over Mirror Mask. except the producer of Mirror Mask was a very good friend of mine, and she, Lisa Henson, and she told me that she'd had Neil and whoever he wrote Mirror Mask with in her house in London, which actually used to be Jim's house, and that they were didn't know what to write and didn't know what to do, and they were looking through Jim's old video collection, and Jim had a copy of Paper House there, and they sat and watched it and just took notes. And that was Lisa told me that, and so I thought, well, okay, I don't really care. I mean, Paper House isn't my idea either, by the way. It's Marianne, not Marianne, Catherine Storr's idea, her book Marianne Dreams. But just to show that ideas all come from, they don't belong to any individual, it's the plots of Shakespeare are all ripped off from something, aren't they? None of them. He didn't invent any of those stories. I don't think one of them. Maybe The Tempest he invented, but he probably stole it from somebody. Fantastic Planet is a rip-off of the Tempest too, isn't it?
Yes, which is also in a Neil Gaiman Sandman comic.
Is it?
It is. There's a whole issue called The Tempest.
Well, so look, I mean, we're all allowed to rip off Shakespeare because he's PD.
Absolutely, yeah.
I actually would go further than that and say that copyright in itself is a destructive concept, in as much as that, one of the beautiful things that happened in the early 90s with the rise of sampling was that people basically were absorbing other people's recordings and ideas and turning them into something new, which is actually the technology was new, but the musical concept of that was very ancient. Beethoven would do things based on Haydn themes and say, he would credit him sometimes and sometimes he wouldn't. Bach used to rip himself off because he'd written so many oratorios. He'd go, oh God, I've got to knock one out by Sunday. And everyone had forgotten the one he wrote 10 years ago because there weren't any recordings and it wasn't pulled out the drawer anymore. So, let's have some of that. Ripped off tons of some of Bach's famous pieces are ripped off of Vivaldi. So I don't think I'm not really complaining about Neil doing that.
No, I know.
We all do that. I think it's only if you know the sources and you identify them that people bring these lawsuits. But I'm not even sure that it's a good thing, because when somebody takes something and reuses it, it always becomes something different.
Right.
And if you don't build on what's gone before, you're starting at square one the entire time, and that's the opposite of progress, I guess.
Yeah. And in adapting Clive Barker's short story, you made some interesting changes to the original material.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's funny that now the film is viewed almost exclusively as a sort of social, racial story, but in fact, that wasn't. I mean, the social aspect of it was in the story because it was set in a housing estate in Kirby, which is a not particularly nice district of Liverpool, yeah, I mean, neither Clive nor I wanted to make a film in the UK at that moment. I think partly because Clive had very bad experience on Hellraiser, where he had to loop everybody, and the setting of Hellraiser became this weird sort of no place.
Yeah.
And I think it was definitely something that he felt had flawed the Hellraiser film, in that its setting was so nondescript, So I very much wanted to give it a proper American setting, and
I'm interested in what motivated, if anything, Chicago in particular, because there's a lot of different cities in America that you could set this, and in fact, the sequels move the action to New Orleans. But I think Chicago in general, and Cabrini Green in particular, is an interesting choice. It was one of the most notorious housing projects in the United States, but not the most dangerous, not even the most dangerous in Chicago. So I guess my question is, was there a what about Chicago in particular? I'm interested to know that.
Well, I didn't want to do it in New York or Los Angeles. But so then Chicago was like the number 3 city, you know, and it has a very different atmosphere, of course, because it's a very big city, but it's also a Midwestern city. So it has a wholly different feel. But also I think that I'd been there, I think, for a film festival. I'd been there briefly, but I hadn't spent any time there. But I knew how fabulous the architecture was. The film is very much about architecture too, and Chicago's history of, you know, in relation to the growth of modernism is key. It's like the great modernist city in many ways. It's where the ideas of Mies van der Rohe and all those kinds of people really took flower, and there's so much great classic architecture. Obviously, in the downtown area, especially, but even sort of stretching out, and you know, even if you took a place like Cabrini Green, which is right by the Gold Coast, or was, it's, as you say, it's been knocked down.
Yep.
In terms of its aesthetics and where it's placed and the buildings and the skyline, it's stunning to look at. So that, obviously that was a huge factor in picking that place specifically. And I did go to other places on the South Side when I was scouting Chicago. I mean, a place I certainly remember going was a place called the Robert Taylor Homes, which was definitely more dangerous than Cabrini Green.
Yeah.
But, you know, everywhere is the same amount of dangerous unless something bad happens. And I think part of what the film ended up being about and what the film was about was the idea that the danger of life in the housing projects is actually exaggerated in many ways, and it's part of the sort of racist treatment of the people in the projects, is that this idea that you can't go there, something terrible will happen to you, you know,
Right.
which isn't really strictly true unless there were other factors involved, I think, you know.
I'm interested to know, just out of pure bold-faced curiosity, what the city's reaction was. Not even necessarily Cabrini Green, the neighborhood, but like the municipality. Were they disinterested in the production? Were they interested in facilitating it? Did you have any help from the city? Anything like that?
Well, I certainly had help from the Illinois Film Commission, which I guess is what the body that would have been in charge of it. They were the people who took me round there initially. So yes, they were completely open to it. I think, you know, in a place like Chicago, they're not closed-minded about things like that. They understand films can be about anything. I mean, you know, the difference between making something like that or Spike Lee making Chirac or something. I don't think they care. They're not there to criticize what you're doing. You know, they're there to bring a production into the city and make some money. I think
Right.
that is their primary aim. I think that's definitely true in American cities. They're not looking to censor or to comment on what the film is about. They want to know how much you're going to spend.
Exactly.
Is it weird that I find that refreshing to hear?
Well, you know, I mean, it is an issue in some places. I mean, it is certainly true that when I was in Russia making Anna Karenina, it was a great and easy answer when they asked what you were doing. You said, "I'm doing Anna Karenina." They just went, "Oh, okay." It was just a totally. There were no more questions because that was an acceptable answer. You know,
Right.
and almost any other answer would have produced more questions, I think.
But it's so nice to have both, you know, Anna Karenina is another good example of how a film can benefit from being at a location and, you know, as a contrast to what you were saying happened with Hellraiser, where you don't understand where you are in space. The location becomes sort of another character in the piece, and it gives you all these different tones that you can work with. And being there as a director, I'm sure it's helpful in doing what you're trying to do and establishing a feeling to a film.
Yeah, I think a specific placement of what's going on in a specific location is absolutely key. Otherwise, it's just floating 5 foot above the air, you know, and there's something very wrong about a film that's set in a nondescript place. Because how do you know what you're even talking about?
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, I think Candyman is also an instance where I think you've got to have the least number of preconceptions if you go somewhere. I didn't have any preconceptions about anything to do with, you know, the racial politics that got involved, but that was just what was there and what was going on in Cabrini Green. So that became a part of the film, not because I was trying to impose that, but because that's what was there, you know. And I think that's why that aspect of it doesn't feel weird or dated in the way that some other, if I'd have gone in with some weird thesis that I'd made up, it probably would be horrifyingly wrong, you know.
No, you leave that to Helen. She has the thesis, but
Well, very much what the original story was about was this person who you know was had all these ideas and philosophies and semiotics
yes,
theories in her head. She's an academic, and the reality is always not so much disappointing to her. It's just more dangerous.
I'm curious, sort of adjacent to some of those ideas, if you, I think you've sort of touched on this in some other interviews, but did you seek out an African American perspective on the film and the characters? And was it challenging to give the characters an authentic voice? Was it something you were really concerned about being sure, or were you just kind of letting the story go?
No, absolutely. I was very concerned about it. And, you know, it was something that I recognized that I didn't know that much about. So, you know, I took a lot of input from Tony and Casey Lemons and, you know, other people who were there. But I was lucky to have, you know, I think if you listen to people and say, what's this? Is this right? Or is this, what is happening here? You know, if you just say, no, I want it done this way and that's that, then you're basically, whatever you're doing, it's going to end up being horrendously wrong.
Right, for sure.
And, you know, I think that just letting other people bring what they have to bring to the table is important there. And I mean, in that aspect and in other aspects too, in every aspect of a film, I think that if you only, I think the enemy of everyone in a movie is imagination. If you imagine something to go a certain way and insist upon it, then the film, every time you do that, the film gets smaller. And
right.
Unless you're making a film that's set entirely in your own head, it's going to be a disaster. Whereas if you listen to people, I mean, there's a lot of things that I remember. For example, Casey Lemons just insisting on, like, just in terms of just stupid things. Like, I remember her saying that, like, when they're driving to Cabrini Green, she says, the gangs held this whole neighborhood hostage, she said. I said, I think I'd written something like the gangs control this whole neighborhood. So I was writing it from the sort of white perspective, and she was saying, no, you shouldn't say that. You should say these people here are being held hostage by the criminal element. And I mean, that's a really small thing, but that was something I just happened to remember that came from her, for example. You know,
That's a great insight, actually, because it does change the meaning of that whole, like, as they're going into it, you know, and you see those what I guess were actual gang members outside of the housing facility, and you know, you stop looking at it as like, this is everyone who lives here versus these are a few people who live here, and then there are just regular people living here.
well, yeah, and you know, that's right. And when I went to Cabrini, I made friends with a lady who was basically the basis for the Amory character, who was living in an apartment with a young child on her own. And and so I pretty much went there and talked to her and based it on her experiences, and nothing terrible had ever happened to her, luckily, but it was just inside her apartment. It was just somebody's apartment. It often happens in places like that where the common parts are really intimidating and unpleasant, but you shut the door and there's the public space and there's the private space. I really tried to show that behind her door it was just a normal apartment.
Yeah, I think the movie does a great job of that because, certainly you do this whole everything in the movie, of course, has all these mirrors with like Helen's apartment being the same as the apartments in Cabrini Green, and are we really different? And then you're going through the looking glass in certain parts. And how did you what made you decide to incorporate the concept of mirrors? Was that something that came from the original story, or why did you choose to use that as sort of a framing device?
Well, actually, interestingly, the mirrors are not in the original story. The whole mirror thing is entirely my invention. I think it was and also the idea of the Helen's apartment in Sandburg Village having the same floor plan as the apartment in Cabrini Green. That's true. And that there's a newspaper article that she's had sort of photostated from the microfilm that she got out of the library. There's some wonderful dead tech microfilm. The Googling, the Googling in the horror film is such a cliche, but it was so much more elegant. The microfilm in the library was kind of, it had a little style to it. Now, I wonder if you could make a horror film without a scene where a character Googled to find out the truth.
It's not the same. I can say that.
Same. I mean, but it is the same. It performs the same function. And
right.
Always, the earlier version of it always was that the characters used to go to the library and look up, 20 years ago, there was a murder on the spot. Some things never change.
Yeah, I always joke that there's a whole group of women who used to have a really good industry in playing the librarian in these movies who lost their job as soon as Google came out.
Yeah.
I never bothered with the librarian because it was very well established. She was in a university, so a library, she'd just walk in. Didn't have to ask where it was, yes. So you've got these two housing developments were built at the same time by the same architect, and the idea that one of them was clad in stud plaster and one of them they left the breeze blocks exposed is true. And these were things I found out in Chicago, and I found that really, really, really fascinating. And I thought that's, in a sense, a slum is preordained. It's created because if they'd have covered the walls in stud plaster, maybe people would have looked after the buildings better. It's just a weird thing, it's like they created it. They were like deliberately not finishing the building properly, making it cheap.
Yes.
It feels cheap.
I did a research project on the history of Cabrini Green a couple years back, and one of the things I found was that the architect of Cabrini Green, the Cabrini Green high-rises, Lawrence Amstetter, the city planners were telling him to paint the numbers on the buildings, the addresses. And he said, well, if we use metal numbers, not only would it look better, it would actually be cheaper. So can I use metal numbers? And they told him no. They told him that public housing had to look utilitarian. Otherwise, it would anger the more affluent sections of the city. And if for anybody watching who's not quite familiar with Chicago or Cabrini Green, it was sitting right next to the Gold Coast, which, as the name implies, was one of the most affluent neighborhoods and still is one of the most affluent neighborhoods of Chicago, which undoubtedly contributed to its reputation.
Development which is where Helen was living.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
So they were those. I think it's the same architect built both places. And it's interesting to hear that he objected to that, but definitely that's what's wrong with Cabrini. There's nothing wrong with the building per se or the layout or the design. It's a perfectly nice apartment building, but it's that they didn't finish it.
Yeah.
Right.
Weird.
Yeah.
And now you tell me they actually had a policy of making it look cheap so as not to anger the taxpayers. How dare you spend money putting people in pleasant, nice homes?
Yeah.
Oh. You have to say that the levels of racism involved in that are so, this is what they mean by systematic racism, I guess. And I think that's what was interesting to me about the subject as a film, is that these things come out in the film as part of the story and are not hammered home. And because I didn't have a thesis, these were things that I discovered when I went round these places in the same way as Helen. So yes, you could say, what was I doing as a white British guy writing this film and doing it? But my answer is, well, I was just doing exactly what Helen was doing, which is just snooping about like an idiot.
Yeah.
And one of the things I like so much about Candyman is the texturing.
Yeah.
Because one can compare it to other really good horror films set in Chicago, like Child's Play, Primal Fear. But those projects sort of feel like they could be set anywhere, whereas Candyman does not feel like it can be set anywhere. It feels like it had to have been told in Chicago.
Well, yeah, and talking as we were talking about earlier, sources and things that one has ripped off. Definitely, a large plot point in the film was ripped off from an article I read in the Chicago Reader about the killer in Cabrini Green who came in through the bathroom cabinets.
Right.
Which is famous. Was famously that I think it came out the week I was there scouting locations. It's just so weird that you can get lucky like that, isn't it? Wow,
lucky in relative terms, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, kind of interesting. Wow. Okay, I'll have that. Take it, man. Funny, I'm going round there tomorrow. That's so interesting. I mean, it's interesting. It's also obviously very creepy and tragic. And by the way, a lot of those apartment blocks from that period, with those kind of recessed medicine cabinets, have that flaw in the design. So if you live in an apartment building, you should go to your medicine cabinet late night.
Yeah.
I feel like the only thing worse than not knowing about a secret passage in your apartment to another unit, is knowing about a secret passage in your apartment.
There was a woman in New York on TikTok, I think, a year ago, who discovered that this very fact about her medicine cabinet, that it led to an empty apartment, and she was literally live streaming it, expecting Candyman to arrive. But she's not the only one. It's quite common. It's like they thought, oh well, if we've got these the two backs of the cabinets back to back, it's just. But the thing is, the cabinets literally they're not actually even screwed into the wall. You can literally pop them out.
Yeah.
And then once you've popped the one out on your side, you could just bash the other one through, and you're in the other person's bathroom.
And personally, I always worry about that when I'm in a hotel, thanks to Candyman. So
just fear is not unfounded. It's like.
So thank you for that, Bernard.
A woman murdered that way in Chicago.
I know. We love to scare ourselves by watching these movies as well as reading true crime stories. So, I mean.
Well, yes. I mean, look, you're very unlikely in real life to be murdered, is the truth.
Yes, certainly. But, sometimes when you're alone late at night and you're hearing a noise, you start remembering all of these things. And
yeah. Noises at night. Where would we be without that?
I know. So I have a question. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask while we were talking about the spaces. When we were talking about Paper House on movie Oubliette, which is a film I dearly love, and if people watching haven't seen Paper House, please go and watch Paper House. It's incredible. But you made an allusion to the fact that you were toying with the artificiality of Anna's bedroom set, that you were consciously toying with the audience's awareness that this was not a real space, and that we are sort of, there is a thin line between the realities and this shared dream that we're experiencing together. And you said you did the same thing in Candyman, and then of course literally Helen punches a hole in the fourth wall and goes into a different space entirely. I was just intrigued when you mentioned that at the time, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your intentions here, because all I can say is it's creepy as hell. It's one of the reasons why the film has its distinctive effect, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that in those two shots that you showed, that when they open the curtains, the views through the windows are not real. Both those scenes were shot on sets in studios, and the views through the windows are actually a technique that's not really used anymore, which was called a translight, which was where you would take a large format photograph of a real view out of a window and have it blown up onto a very, very, very large translucent screen, which would then be lit from behind. So although it was a backing, it was lit from behind, so it had a luminescence, especially at night. It was very, very effective and very convincing, but it wasn't real. There's always something slightly off about the perspective. If you move slightly off axis, it doesn't really quite line up. So there's also something kind of fake about it. It's not a technique that's used anymore, because now it's so damned easy to just drop anything in behind. You can just put it in. I mean, but it was a common technique in the 80s and early 90s. So that's that's where you see the sort of those two things. And obviously, Helen's apartment had to be opposite Cabrini Green, so you had to see through her window. You had to see the L train and the freeway and Cabrini behind us. So it couldn't be done unless we'd actually gone and shot in Sandburg Village, which we did actually for an exterior, but we didn't want to do the interiors in there. I think we were actually only in Chicago for 4 or 5 days.
Oh wow!
Oh wow!
Just such a great job of making it feel like Chicago, though.
Well, because when she opens her window, you see Cabrini out the window. But
right? Yeah.
In Los Angeles, and most of the interiors of Cabrini Green were constructed on a set in LA. The only bits that are actually shot in Cabrini is obviously the helicopter shots and the exteriors in the day, and the big exterior at night when she goes back. But the rest of it, we had a balcony and the stuff outside of Anne-Marie's apartment is all a set. All of it.
Wow.
When you go out the stairwell, it's real.
The bonfire scene in the end, that was not on location.
No, it wasn't in LA either, because actually at that time you couldn't light a fire that size in LA County. I'm sure you can't do that today.
Oh wow!
The fire risk is so big there, you know. They're terrified of fires in LA.
Well, yeah,
rightfully so.
So I wanted to ask about there are of course a lot of interpretations of meaning in this film, and I like the idea that I think you've talked about before, which is you kind of want it to be open to interpretation, because that's kind of what art is for. But I wanted your opinion on the take that this is a film in which Helen loses herself in the legend of Candyman, and that she in fact imagines him and commits all of these atrocities herself. Obviously that's kind of hinted at, it's never really made clear. Was that an intentional suggestion, like as a possible through line for the plot? Do you think it's a viable interpretation of the film, or what's your take on that?
Yes, I think it is.
Okay.
I mean,
I love that as a
for me, I never really, Clive, and this is definitely a difference between me and Clive. Clive is a believer, I think Clive believes that he communes with demons.
I believe that too. Just reading his stuff.
And if he doesn't, he's very persuasive about it. So I think that's just how Clive. It's just what goes on in Clive's head, but it's not what goes on in mine. I think that one of the things that I was very, it was important to me was that the film was very grounded in almost documentary details, in all the details about the housing and the state and the semiotics of urban legends and myths and all that. So to me, to me, there was always this possibility that he was just something that he was a hallucination, a vision of hers. And even if he's real, he's still a hallucination of hers. Because,
Right.
even throughout history, the sort of ecstatic visions of saints, of godheads of any kind, are always personal only to them, and their struggle is always that no one else believes them. That's, from Joan of Arc onwards, and obviously there's a sort of Joan of Arc trajectory there.
Yep.
Fine. So, that's just how it goes with people in that situation. I mean, it was also one of my thoughts it came about very much with I didn't want to make it clearly that thing or the other thing. I always remember The Tenant, the Polanski film, which is, I think, a wonderful film. This is not an endorsement of Roman and his behavior.
Understood.
It's a wonderful film, and it's a very powerful film. But the film, which is beautifully photographed by Sven Nykvist, and very powerful and just elegant and very, very creepy and frightening in the way that it sort of shows his sort of mental breakdown, the progression of his mental breakdown, his descent into madness. But there's a point almost exactly at the halfway point in that film where he's become very paranoid, and he's starting to think that the people who run the apartment building are actually demonic, and they're trying to torture him, and they're trying to make his life a misery. And there might be someone else. They might not be who they claim to be. There's all sorts of things going on. And there's a point where he gets hit by a car, and he's trying to get back into his apartment, and he's trying to get back up the stairs. And he sees these people, and they're like advancing on him, and it's in a wide angle lens, and it's really disturbing. And suddenly they cut to a shot of, he's actually played by Polanski, of course, this character. And it's very clear that it's not really happening. It's a cut. It's the exact halfway point in The Tenant. I think it's, for me, the whole movie deflated at that moment. I mean, it picks up again because the ending is absolutely stunning and terrifying. But for me, I was like, "Oh, why?" Well, it would be so much better not to know, right?
There's one shot in Candyman that I recall, where so the scene right after spoiler alert, where after Candyman kills the psychiatrist.
Yes.
And then he reaches forward with his claw and he undoes Helen's restraints.
Correct. Yes.
But in context, it always felt to me less like a confirmation that Candyman was real, and more as if it almost makes it more ambiguous. It's like it's daring the audience to. It's like, I dare you to say Candyman is real.
And she's an unreliable narrator as well.
Yeah.
So you just almost go, was she even in restraints? Because they've made it clear she's kind of hallucinating in that beautiful scene where he's sort of floating down over her. And I mean, it's filmed so well. It's just so creepy looking.
Well, that was in direct response, I think, to the moment in The Shining when Jack Nicholson's locked in the larder, and I think it's Philip Stone character Grady lets him out.
Right.
Well, you're going to do your job now, Mr. Torrance. And you hear the door unlocking. And so, I think that's a very similar thing. I think Kubrick is very ambiguous because he absolutely makes a very serious point of not showing Grady in that scene. And we've come to believe that all the people are hallucinations. But now, finally, in that scene, one of these hallucinations actually opens a door for him. It's actually a very, very clever scene. But we don't really know that he did it.
It's an interesting parallel because you were talking about how Clive is very much sort of a magical believer, whereas you are not. And that sort of mirrors, no pun intended, the whole, Stephen King being the original book, The Shining, being so much more magical versus Kubrick sort of making it much more a study of psychosis and alcoholism and child abuse and all of these very real world things.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and I think that Kubrick was a sort of ultra rationalist. And there's the famous description that King has, the story he tells about, he called Kubrick and said, what about hell or something, and because Kubrick was saying he thought ghosts were comforting because there was some sort of evidence of the afterlife. and King replied by saying, well, what about hell? To which Kubrick said, I don't believe in hell. I think I'm with Stanley on that one.
Yeah.
I don't believe in hell. Clive quite possibly does. But I think that's in the same way as with The Shining. I think that seeing as the whole point about Candyman is it's sort of a film about belief in certain ways, that's the point, is that whether you accept or not, don't accept something magical is irrelevant somewhat.
I feel like this movie, one of my favorite horror movies of all time is The Haunting.
Yes.
And it's scary because you don't see the monster. And even though in Candyman, for example, you see the monster, you don't really see and understand what he is. And it's great, in my opinion, because it doesn't explain and it leaves it open. And so that's what makes it feel creepy inside, is like, is this all in her head? Is this some sort of evil force that's, and her losing track of time,
Also,
makes
he's
you feel
not
so, yeah.
He's not a monster, he's
Yeah,
not
no.
a lover, really.
Right.
And there were people at one point, I can't remember who started this, there was some people attacked the film by saying, oh, it's terrible, why is this film showing black people killing black people? And I've always said, how do you know that's who's doing the killing?
Exactly. Well, that's why it's so compelling, is because you don't ever see him really. I mean, you do. He kills the psychiatrist, but again, by that point, you fairly well established that it could be her.
It could be her, the psychiatrist.
Exactly.
I think that's the most obvious kill that belongs to her.
Right.
It isn't one of those kills that she didn't have an opportunity for.
I mean, people blacking out, waking up, not knowing where they are, it's all, And I noticed that you have that. Actually, I was going to let you know, because of Conrad's podcast, I listened to the episode that he did about Paper House, and then I was like, how have I saw that movie as a kid in the movie stores all the time. Why did I never watch it? I always meant to. Went back and watched it, fell in love with it. I'm so grateful that Conrad covered that. But there are a lot of similarities in terms of, you've got this character who doesn't really understand. They kind of get sucked into this other world a little bit all the time, and playing with reality versus dreams, or what is compelling to you about that, in terms of, do you sort of just like keeping the audience unsure about where they are?
What really interested me about Paper House is, if you're in a movie, if you say something is a dream and you say something is reality, it has literally zero meaning, because you're actually presenting them with exactly the same thing, which is a piece of film.
Right.
So the things, dreams have much more solidity in a movie than they do in real life, where we kind of vaguely glimpse them while we're asleep and wake up and can't really remember them. I'm always astonished at, like, when you read Freud or something, and these people describe in great detail these complex dreams, and I go, are they just making it up? Which of course is true on both levels, but how would you know whether they actually had that dream, or whether they were not? Oh God, I got to go see Sigmund today. I better come up with something good.
Well, either way, it's coming out of their head.
He's going to get bored with me. I'm going to get that look. He's going to start yawning.
Yeah. I was just going to show a clip, because you were talking about, you alluded to the romanticism, and one thing that always has struck me is, I mean, Virginia Madsen is a stunningly beautiful woman, and in a way that she seems to come from a different era of cinema almost. And I noticed that the lighting on her seems to come from almost a different era of cinema too. I'll just play this little clip to remind people.
Be my victim. Be my victim.
Oh, Tony
Yes.
Todd is just so great.
But it is a seduction, isn't it?
Well, completely it is. Yes, of course.
Yeah.
But that thing you're talking about, the lighting, is interesting because the DP on Candyman is a guy called Tony Richmond, and Tony had worked. He shot Don't Look Now, the Nick Rogue film, but the reason Nick Rogue was a DP, and Tony had been his assistant for many years, and they worked together on Dr. Zhivago, which Tony, I think, well, Nick was the DP on Dr. Zhivago, and he fell out with David Lean, and David Lean fired him and brought in Freddie Young to finish the film. Tony stayed on the picture with Freddie Young. So it's that thing of DPs of that generation. They all used to be in teams and they stuck together for long periods of time, and learned off each other very directly. And you know, as I don't know if you're aware, I've DP'd a number of films, but you know, to me, I'm working with someone like Tony. As much as anything, I want to know, how would Freddie Young like that? How would Nick Road like that? And that to me is more interesting than, you know, that you can't get that info off anybody anymore because, you know, that era's gone. Now you know, you can find out how they lit you know, some boring commercial, which is not terribly interesting to me. But there was a way of lighting the close-ups of Julie Christie, specifically in Dr. Zhivago, and in that sense where the lights on her eyes but kind of shaded off. They're almost like a sort of Zorro mask, the light, which I wanted to use in the scenes where she's confronting the Candyman. And so I think I said to Tony, "Oh, just light it, you know, do the Zhivago Julie Christie close." Oh yeah, because I know how to do that. But you know, if you ask that to somebody now, they'd be like, "Oh, what do you mean?"
Yeah.
But you know, that's just it's interesting how that has changed in that. That's 30 years ago. You know, it's actually a long time ago. It's a couple of generations, really.
Yeah.
I don't want to think that, but yes, you're right.
Yeah.
So you continue to work with Tony Todd, and I know he's been unfortunately held up, and we're not sure he'll be able to join us. But what is it about your working relationship that makes you guys work so well together? Do you think?
Well, I think, you know, Tony, obviously he's a great actor, but he also has a very unusual kind of appeal, in that he's got that voice, and it doesn't hurt.
No, it doesn't.
And you know, he's just a great and very unique presence. And we did Frankenstein, which is also one of my favorite and deeply underrated movies, if I say so myself. And Tony plays the blind beggar in it, and have you seen it? He sings "Mannish Boy" in the underpass by the old 6th Street Bridge in LA. They've also knocked down recently. And he was rather wonderful in the film. And so then we did that, and also more recently in 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, Tony and I made a film called Traveling Light, which actually is going to open in New York City on August the 12th.
I'm glad you said that, because I heard you mention it on your appearance on Conrad's podcast, and I've been thinking it was out, and I was looking everywhere for it, and I couldn't find it because it sounds so interesting to me.
No, it played a week in LA like just last month, but it's going to actually open in New York. We're just getting small little theatrical engagements around the country. It's going to actually, I think you're in Seattle, right?
I'm in Atlanta. Serge is in Seattle. Yeah.
Oh, Serge in Seattle. That's right. I think we're actually going to open in Seattle the following week on the 19th.
Yeah.
So but in that film, Tony stars in it. He plays
Nice.
Uber driver who's sort of driving through the sort of.
I am writing that down.
Yeah. and it's in the opening weeks of the pandemic, and we actually shot it in May 2020. So none of us knew what was going on and what was going to happen. And he's just, and it's a sort of, to say it's improvised, I think is the wrong impression, because most improvised films, what they really mean is that they're ad-libbed. This was improvised in as much as we had no idea what we were going to do from moment to moment, because nobody did. It was like this sort of weird breach in history that was going on around us, and nobody really had a clue. And I think the film is really, I'm very proud of it. I think it's quite very powerful. And Tony, we were driving around downtown LA picking people out, and there's all the terrible encampments of homeless people down there and stuff like that. And it's really kind of a lot of problematic things going on. And Tony suddenly starts talking about how he's looking for his son in the homeless encampment. And I had no idea that he was going to launch into this. So I thought I was just doing a bit. But actually, he was really genuinely looking for it.
Wow.
And
I can't wait to see this.
And it was actually very powerful. And it was really, and so it became, so the film developed like that. And then it all starts to involve this kind of cult leader who lives up on a hill that's played by Danny Houston and is up to no good. And, I think that it's interesting because obviously when I started the film, I thought maybe it was going to be a film about disease and death. But, as everyone really, when you're looking back, the weird thing about it, there's 10 times more COVID now than there ever was in May 2020. It's just nobody cares anymore.
Right.
So you have to say that the event was more a sort of psychological event than an actual disease event. I mean, obviously it's a disease event as well.
Right.
I'm not downplaying that aspect of it, but so I think what was interesting about the film, because again, we were responding to what was really happening, as to there certainly wasn't time for me to come up with some thesis about the coronavirus. And I certainly couldn't even now. I couldn't begin to have an opinion about any of it, because every time I read something about it, it just seems like pure nonsense.
Well, I work in medical research and I feel the same way. So,
Yeah, they really haven't got a clue, have they? They don't know what they're talking about. Is that right?
Well, we know some things, but it's just very hard to make hard and fast statements about a moving target. Like you have to have some distance to be able to parse the data, I think. So
exactly correct. And one other thing that happened while we were shooting this film is I was doing a scene with Tony where he's in his car wash, and he's getting his car washed, and it comes on the radio, the whole thing about the murder, lynching of George Floyd, and he just was reacting to it. But it was just happening in real time around us, and these sort of extreme situations where you had a whole city shut down, and then this sort of horrendous sort of judicial execution in the street, and so then the film started to take place on these very extreme elements. But saying all these things, I don't want it to sound depressing, because I think the film is actually very funny. And Tony is very wonderful in it, and it's such a great performance from him. I think he's very, very, very underrated. I mean, obviously he's done so much great work in the genre and all those things, but he's really a terrific actor, and I think that he's in, where is he now? He's about to do the August Wilson play now, isn't he? He's in where is it? That's why he was traveling today, and that's why he's ended up.
He's here. He's just joined us.
Tony, you heard me talking about you.
We were just talking about you.
I am so sorry for my delay. I arrived here in Pennsylvania for the Shakespeare Festival, and I'm homeless.
No.
I was staying in a hotel that was above a Waffle House last night, and now I got the company manager scrambling to find me proper accommodations. But I wanted to sit in the car in sweltering heat, and I could not miss it. Bernard, I love you. Without you, I wouldn't be on the horror map. And guys, I don't know how long I can stay here, but I just want you to know, if I say I'm going to do something, I'm here. So thank you for the Candyman community, and most importantly, you, Bernard.
Well, thank you, Tony. I was just telling them about how we were driving around downtown LA on Traveling Light, and you say you were searching for your son, and I was like, oh, that's a really great bit that Tony's doing, but you were really looking for him, right?
I was really looking for him, and I'm still looking for him in real life, and Hold on a second. The company manager is coming up to me. I think I might have some progress. I'm in the middle of a Zoom. Yes, sir.
See, this is improvisation at
I'll
work.
pop him out just till he's done,
No,
just so he has some
come in.
privacy.
You see, this is what I'm talking about. Things happening in real time. It's more exciting.
Yes, absolutely. It is.
You have to let the door open.
Guys,
So
I'm
that
so
real
sorry.
life.
They got me on the move again.
We understand, but
I owe you guys a separate interview, if that's okay, Bernard. But personally, Traveling Light is one of the most provocative, personally important films I've ever been a part of. And each territory that we go to, people are discovering it. And I hope it has a long shelf life because it's very personal and it's very passionate. And you start telling them about our next project, Bernard, our next film?
I'm
okay. I'm sorry. Anyway, right now I'm doing theater, guys. I love theater. That's my first passion, but they're plucking my last nerves.
Well, Tony, we really appreciate
my company
you.
manager's over there pulling out their hair, and it's not you. You know that, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, you're doing the August Wilson,
I gotta go.
right?
This will be the third hotel I'm gonna be going to Sunday.
Tony, are you doing the August Wilson play, right?
Yes, I'm doing Fences right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I played Troy Max in one of the greatest roles ever written for any actor. I don't care what color they are.
Well, we appreciate you finding a time in your very hectic schedule, everything you've got going on, to talk with us, even for a few minutes.
We'll stay in touch, and we'll find a time to either do this again with the duo or however you guys want, okay?
We'd be thrilled to have you anytime,
I just
Tony.
had to tell you that it's an unexpected thing.
Understandable. No worries at all.
You came in just at the point when I was explaining that the best way to make a movie was to leave the door open so that things could enter into the movie rather than everything being preconceived, and then you turned up.
Yeah, everything, and then it turned up. So obviously my ears are burning.
It was like we said your name 5 times.
Burning up. It's 92 degrees out. We have to travel on.
Okay.
I hope you find a home soon.
Thank
Cheers
you
to the Candyman community. Thank you.
Thank you.
I almost went Candyman today. I'll tell you that. All right, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care, Tony.
Bye-bye.
Still made my day. I'm a huge fan of Tony Todd.
It was just calmly going through the same stale old Candyman anecdotes, isn't it? It's more exciting.
Yes.
That's what I'm talking about. You know, you got to. We're all so used to things being a certain way. You know, it's this thing. And again, please let me preface this. No. I would be very foolish to say this is something bad or not how you should make a movie. But, you know, the way that Kevin Feige makes movies is that he has a previs, not just each shot and setup, but he has like literally an animated version of the whole movie that they have fed into the monitor on set. So the job of the director and the actors on set is to match the movie that's essentially worked out in all details. Now, I'm sure they sometimes deviate. They have to. Otherwise, it would be just so stale. But I mean, obviously, to a very large degree, there's no other way of working a thing that's got huge, extravagant things that you're trying to react and play with that literally aren't there. There's really kind of not. There's no other practical way of doing it. But it's that thing. What I'm saying is that if what's defining your film is your imagination, it's staggeringly limiting because it's limited to your imagination, which is, you know, it's limited to what you're going to tell Freud that you pretended you dreamed of. But that's not to say that kind of filmmaking is invalid or wrong or lesser, but to me, it's limited. And I think that's what people respond to when they say too much CGI.
Yeah, I think, you know, the brain, just visually, you can tell, like you were talking about fire earlier, your brain knows that something's not quite right. It's sort of like, to me, even with Avatar, like when I try to watch something like that, even with all of the amazing stuff that they can do with CGI, the human mind from an early age is geared to recognize the human face. Like, it's just something that we as infants learn to recognize the first thing we see. And so you notice imperceptibly small differences and you can tell it's not real. And it just, you know, it's difficult.
And also you have, like, for example, in Candyman, and this is an example that I love to give, is obviously in the film that Tony and I made, the bees were real. In all the other films, including the earlier sequels, they were never real again. And partly for safety reasons, because we all did get stung, and partly for animal rights issues, and also because it was fucking difficult to do. We had a wrangler who was kind of a genius, and he did it. But my point is that for all the suffering and the difficulty and all the problems with doing it, and the fact that the whole point is the bees never went where they were told; they went where they wanted to go.
Of course,
so you can tell when those bees. If you animate a bee, it's going to go where you think the shot should be, and it's a bee doing a ballet, you know. Whereas the bees that we were using were on their own time. They were angry.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're like, what's this nonsense? Where are we? We should be out collecting flowers. We don't want to be in your film, you know.
I have a clip of the bees if people want to remember.
I do want to see the bees. They freak me out.
Yeah, they're all self-motivated.
Someone with a bee allergy. It's just really unnerving.
The thing that makes that scene is actually not the visuals. It's the piece of paper being crumpled up.
It is. It's just.
It's the sound effect of the crunching.
Yes.
That gets you in film.
Yeah. I also, speaking of sound, I wanted to talk about Hugh Glass's score a little bit. Philip Glass. I don't know why I said that. Philip Glass's score is just, you know, I became familiar with him more later in documentary films like The Thin Blue Line and stuff like that. But what was it like? I feel like it really sets the tone of this movie apart from a lot of previous and subsequent horror films. It's just, it almost elevates even more. And points out like the fact that it's sort of saying more than it's just like, oh, it's Jason stabbing people in the woods who are having sex. Like, this is sort of more of a, it's doing a lot. And so were you involved in choosing that score, or how did that come about?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, you know, music is one of my passionate interests, and you know, I am a classical pianist myself, but I remember we were about halfway through the shoot, and I was talking to one of the producers, Alan Poole, who had been Alan had an unusual background in that he spoke fluent Japanese and had been Paul Schrader's interpreter on Mishima. So we got talking about who we'd like to have as the composer, and I said, Philip Glass is who I want. Somebody like Philip Glass. And of course, he knew him because he'd been Paul's assistant on Mishima. And so Alan just said, well, I'll call him for you, see if he wants to do it. So he did. And he did, which was lovely. I mean, because you know, I've made 3 films with Philip now over the years. And I adore him. And he's, you know, for me, he is the most important American composer in the post-World War II era in many ways.
He's amazing.
He's the guy who moved modern classical music out of 12-tone and atonality back in, but didn't go into a pastiche style. He went into a kind of contrapuntal, just this way he uses. Everyone thinks that the whole point about Philip is the repetition. Actually, the whole point about Philip is when he changes.
Yeah, his themes really evolve. Like, they go somewhere. They don't just like keep sampling the same thing. That's what makes it so amazing. Yeah.
Very precise, and it's very difficult to play because you know there are you are doing maybe the same triplet for a while, and you better look out because it's coming up soon. You have to change, you know.
Yeah.
And it's very dynamic when he does that, and his work is very melodic too. And of course, the sort of minimalist style that he's best known for, he kind of pretty much had abandoned by the mid-90s. And if a lot of his recent stuff is very different, actually.
Yeah. I mean, it still has a sound that he has his own sound, but he's
Very much
definitely
so.
evolved over the years for sure.
Yeah, and I love some of the latest symphonies. They're really beautiful. And he did the score for the film I made in 2018, Samurai Marathon, which he did fabulous work on. It's very exciting.
Is it true that he had reservations about working on a horror film?
Well, he didn't have reservations when he wrote the score. He had reservations. What happened? Because the way we did it is, Philip's not really a traditional film composer. He's not the sort of person you can run a cut for and say, start the cue here and end it there and sting this bit. I mean, that's just how it's normally done, but it doesn't really work like that with Philip. What we did was, I ran him a very early assembly of the film. And, you know, an early assembly in 1992 was different than it would be now because there was very little on the soundtrack. And if I had got any temporary music, I obviously stripped it out because it's very, very rude to run a composer a film with somebody else's temp music on it, or even worse, with their own temp music on it. Unless you're basically just asking them to license it. So I ran it for him, and it was long, and it had long silences in it and long gurs. It didn't have any sound effects in it. I think he thought the film was rather strange and arty, so he liked it.
Right.
And he went away and he wrote me a suite. I wish I had the damn tape. He demoed it and sent it. I wish I had that tape because it was rather beautiful and it was different from any other version that has appeared of it since, because it was much longer. It was like a whole thing, and it was demoed. But one thing we agreed on is there was only going to be organ, voices, and piano, and a music box. That was it. There was not going to. There's no strings. There's no percussion. There's no brass. It's very, very, very minimal in terms of its orchestration, and the vocal track was going to be just, you know, R's, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I then took this demo and I cut the film with it, and I cut the music up as well so that it fit in the various bits. And it was always the case, I didn't want the music to sting the suspense or create unease or any of that. I wanted it to be a different layer of commentary on what was going on. And, you know, of course, at the time, in the early 90s, this was the classic great era of the emergence of all the rap artists. So, I mean, that was another way we could have gone. And there were a lot of people who said, why aren't you using some of, you know, the stuff that's coming out? Because that was, you know, the great era of the, you know, all the stuff that came out of that era. But I thought that would just tie it so much to that moment, and that the music wasn't about where it wasn't about what would be playing in Cabrini. It was more about what was in Helen's head, you know, and so it had the more ethereal. And also I wanted it to have almost be like Candyman's music, which would have a more 19th century. Candyman's, you know, he's from the 1870s, 1880s.
Right.
He's not from now. So I didn't want to use, you know, I didn't want to use contemporary music in that sense. Though, of course, in retrospect, that was such a great period of rap music. That was the classic period, really. And this was the brief, and then I used the music to cut it up, and then Michael Reisman, who conducts and arranges for Philip, he took the cut up demos and he made them into scores, and he recorded it with Philip has a group of musicians called the Philip Glass Ensemble, which always record his work, and they did that in New York to the cues that had been basically fitted to the cut versions of the film, and then they sent it back to me, and I just laid it back in and just dropped it on top of the demos. and it sounded much better. It was real voices, it was real organ, it was the piano playing. I don't know who played the piano. I think Michael Reisman played the piano actually. That was the score. And so Philip hadn't been personally. Philip gets very busy, you know. He's always got 10 things on the go, and so he'd written it. Philip works on paper, you know, like this, hands it in. They make the demo. They send it to me. Michael Reisman recorded it. We put it on the film. We mixed the film. The film was finished. The film was released, and it was playing in Times Square. So Philip goes there. He goes, "Oh, my movie's on." So he takes a bunch of his friends to Times Square to go watch the movie, and he remembered this weird. I think his friends went in there and were like terrified. And like,
Yeah.
and they go, "Philip, you didn't tell us you'd made a horror film." I think he got a little scared. He got a little freaked out, and so he pulled up Alan, who got him into this mess in the first place, and yelled at him and said, "What do you never told me this was a horror film, blah blah blah." So Alan was kind of slightly amused because it's like, "Well, you did see the film, Philip. I don't know what you were thinking it was." So anyway, so I didn't speak to Philip for many years, and he never put the score out on any medium, and that was the end of it. And then in 2009, 2008, I guess, I was making Mr. Nice, which was about Howard Marks, the guy who invented the marijuana business. So, which was actually also a very underrated film of mine. You should check out. It's a very good stuff. And
I'm taking notes.
And Philip's manager called me up as we were like preparing that film and saying, you know, would you consider Philip to the score? And I said, consider him? Of course, I'd love to have him do the score. It'd be perfect for him. So, sort of film set in the 60s and 70s. That's Philip's era. Yeah, he'd be great, and he'd do some weird stoner stuff. He's perfect for it. And so I said yes, and they hired him, and they made a deal. And all the while I'm thinking, but what about what happened with Candyman? And so I never said anything. And I then went to New York to meet with Philip because there was some stuff we had to record before we shot, used for playback, and an Irish jig, believe it or not, which he wrote, the most fabulous Irish jig. Philip can do anything. And so I went there to see him, and we were talking, and we were going through it and going through what he was going to do. And we were having a very nice time. Eventually I said, okay, I've got to ask you, Philip, what was the deal with Candyman? He went, But I was just being stupid. And I said, well, so what changed your mind? And he said, well, he said, see, I was going through, you know, the accounts of all the things I was getting PRS payments from, and, you know, ASCAP payments, BMI payments. And he says, and I noticed that the number one earner for years has been Candyman.
Yeah.
Because it had been on basic cable like throughout the entire 90s. I mean, he has like 40 minutes of music in the film, and he was making bank off it. And so he said to his manager, call that guy up, let's do it again.
Often imitated, never duplicated.
It's a really, 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 really good score.
Yes. It elevates like all these things, like you're thinking about, like, I remember I used to have this horror compilation thing that was for Halloween, and they would have all the key themes from all of the slasher horror movies or whatever. But then you get to Candyman, and it's just like, well, this is just leagues above. Like it's.
And as much as I love Carpenter's minimalist,
Oh yeah,
stuff,
yes,
but it's still,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I very much like the theme to Rosemary's Baby. Actually, that's kind of rather good.
Certainly, there are some great ones, in Mike Oldfield with his tubular bells from The Exorcist.
That was not written for The Exorcist.
No, but it was used in The Exorcist, so everyone associates it.
It does, and it's weird because when you see the movie, it's barely in the movie.
Yes,
it's not driving any of it, really. It's like it's almost an afterthought. It's weird. It's odd that it's so associated with the film, really.
Yeah, I almost wonder if it's because it's been, you know, used on all those horror movie compilation things. Like, I know I always had them at Halloween. You just sort of put them in the background, and
But you see, The Exorcist is also a very good example of using sound design to terrify people, and I think it was really The Exorcist that elevated that to another level, because there are no musical stings in The Exorcist, and it's one of the reasons it's so scary.
It's just like in Candyman, like the fact that you're not using music that people are very familiar with, that sounds like things that they know, that you don't have a drum beat that's sort of like grounding people, it helps keep the audience completely off kilter and not sure what to expect, because it's so foreign. Certainly in the 90s, like when the movie came out, it's just like, what is happening? I feel very uneasy right now. So it does add a lot, for sure.
Well, yeah, I mean, the one of the masters of that sort of uneasy soundscape, of course, is David Lynch. He kind of invented that with Eraserhead,
Yes.
and has always, I mean, I think he does it himself. He's always credited as the sound designer, usually on those pictures, and he's definitely a master of it. So those low tones, I think they physically affect you.
David Lynch's, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things about this movie that for me really makes it resonate is the fact that Candyman, while he's sort of the villain, he's also a very tragic figure, and I think Tony Todd does such a great job of playing sort of both tragic monsters, like he does it in a lot of other things that he's in, where he may be the bad guy, but he's also got this tragic thing. And I know Conrad and I talked about previously, like, he's got almost a sadder story, or definitely has a sadder story than any of his victims almost. So how did you sort of want to tell that story, or can you talk a little bit more about that, of him being this tragic bad guy?
Well, I don't think he's really the bad guy.
Right. Yeah.
And I never did. I think he's the victim, in a sense, who's, and he's not even looking for vengeance. And yet, he only comes when he's called, for a start. So you don't want him there, don't call him.
True.
People call him because they can't resist, because that's how people are, They want to test themselves. They want to see what's going to happen. And also, I think that I think he's a lover. He's not a killer. That's the point.
He's not pursuing Helen he is. I mean, the goal is to kill her, but he's pursuing her for her consent, or at least for her permission.
He's like he's
to kill her.
Sensual murderer. It's weird, but it's true.
Yeah.
And that does come from Clive too. I think, I think that is definitely a thing that's very Clive Barker. The idea that there's a sexual element to being murdered, as being penetrated, and I think that's something that's definitely Clive feels personally, And I loved that. I thought that was powerful. I thought it was strong. The only thing that's the way you can feel somebody's like real core kinks is always good, And Clive's shy about being a little kinky.
No, not at all.
No.
He offers her an immortality that you, unlike in the short story, you actually give her at the end, and I love the ending and Virginia Madsen being the monster for her partner. And I was almost intrigued by the idea of, if you picked up the story for a sequel after this, where would you go from there? But I think you had very, very different ideas for where you could go from there.
Did, but it was all a bit too soon and a bit too sudden. And as much as I think the thing that I wrote supposedly as a sequel, they rejected it, but they weren't entirely wrong. But they were suddenly in a rush. They suddenly were like, "Oh, we can make some money," and blah blah blah. And, but I don't think that Bill Condon's film is bad per se. It's actually quite a well done thing. The first sequel, I just think that it just feels like it just feels unnecessary. But you're absolutely right. The real sequel to Candyman has never been written and never been made, and it should start the following morning, where they go in and find Xander Berkeley in the bath. That's how it should start.
Yeah.
I mean, really, it's so obvious. But
I find it curious that it's had 3 sequels and nobody's thought to mention Helen.
Yeah.
It's so wrong. Well, I think she's mentioned in Jordan Peele's film.
She definitely
There's
is
a vocal cameo, yeah.
Well, and they talk about the whole her saving the baby who is
yeah. I think starting with the baby was a cute idea, definitely. But I think that it also has a very interesting perspective. But the real sequel should be about Helen, shouldn't it?
Mm.
Yeah,
I guess.
I do love the many nods to your film that are in the new film. Even the opening shot as they're coming in, using the concept of mirrors and reflections instead of looking at the city, looking at the reflection of the city, and it feels like there are a lot of like love letters to your movie, or at least that was my read on it when I saw it, and I was like, wow, that's so nice to see. Like the music is so similar but different. There's just a lot of little things here and there. Did you find that like what was your take on when you saw that new movie? If you're willing to talk about it.
No, I'm more than happy to talk about it. I think that I'm a huge admirer of what Jordan Peele does, and I think the thing that's slightly interesting that most people aren't aware of is that he was attached to doing that some time before Get Out came out. So before that, he kind of became enshrined as he suddenly became the great Jordan Peele. And he went from being half of a comedy duo to being like a very important producer almost overnight. It was a pretty stunning transformation. And it's interesting that he was attached to developing a Candyman sequel, which I presume. Well, he wrote the script, of course. I haven't read the script that he wrote, or the one that was they were originally working from. But he was working on that, and then of course, everything intervened, and he became Jordan Peele, and making a sequel to someone else's movie was probably less appealing. But I was very happy that he carried on with it, in a very hands-on way, and I think that was that. It's obviously it's I think it's a good kind of amplification and reflection on the film. I think you can't. It's that same thing. It comes back to that thing. Am I offended of Neil Gaiman taking things? In the end, of course not. It's flattering.
Yeah.
I remember when the first time it ever happened to me. I remember being quite shocked. Was actually when I did the Frank Here's to Hollywood Relax video, and Brian De Palma literally ripped my video off shot for shot in body double. Literally. And he took all the gay stuff out and made it. So we completely lost the point of it, I thought.
Yeah, I was about to say, isn't that the point?
I know. I mean, I was like, okay, Brian, you've just taken the shots. But it was still good, though, because De Palma has a lot of style. And I like Body Double. It was a good movie. But I remember sitting there thinking, being slightly astonished. Because I was very young at the time still. Barely out of film school. And like, wow, Brian De Palma has stopped ripping off Hitchcock, and now he's ripping off me.
That is flattering.
It's flattering. You see, if you put it that way, it's different.
Yeah.
So, and it's not even ripping off. But it's important people like Jordan or De Palma or Gaiman are taking your stuff. You think, well, I must be doing all right then. I wish they'd pay me, but never. Jordan paid me. So
you're like the Tom Waits of the film world.
Yes. I think you can. It is a way to judge somebody how much they're stolen from.
Yeah.
I mean, like everybody steals from Kubrick. Everyone steals from Billy Wilder. Some people you can't steal from. No one steals from Pasolini because it's impossible. And what are you going to do? It's very hard to start to pin down.
Sure.
I know. I appreciated the fact that the latest sequel, the Jordan Peele and Nia DaCosta one, it's definitely, I think, the sequel that's most interested in the original.
Yes.
Yes, it is. So the Bill Condon film has it has the direct follow-on of having Michael Culkin, the Purcell character.
Mm.
The one
for a couple of minutes.
Yes, the one in the middle is that's the one that you have to say. I haven't even seen it, to be honest with you. But nobody said anything good to me about it.
I think it's interesting just to study it as a sequel. I don't know. I think it's very difficult to make a sequel. I almost wonder what your thoughts are on it. I know that I think I've heard you say in the past in other interviews that it's not really terribly interesting to you to do a sequel, but it seems like to do one well, you would really have to go above and beyond and have some really good ideas. And a lot of times people don't come to those projects with the intent or with the I don't know, with the mindset of really adding. They're almost more tagging on to the original.
It's a very it's much harder to make a sequel than it is to make in the horror genre. I mean, they're always wanting sequels. And, you know, the only ones they've ever really happily been able to sequelize again and again as Friday the 13th, and I guess even the Halloween ones, it's just they feel like repetitions rather than sequels, don't they?
I think it's sort of like making a carbon copy of a carbon copy, and it just gets lossier and lossier as you do it.
They add lore.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few
Convoluted
examples of good sequels within things. Like, I'm a huge Nightmare on Elm Street fan, so I can pick out certain sequels in that franchise that are doing new things.
Number 3 was good.
Yeah, the third one is really good. I even think the new Nightmare is good, even though it's not a perfect movie. At least he was really trying to do something different, and add a new layer, which is something that doesn't get done a lot in these sequels.
You know, you have situations like Exorcist 2, which is actually a fascinating film that people just hate with such a passion. They hate it with such a passion, it must be an important movie.
And Exorcist 3 also, I think, is like a hugely underrated film. It's so good.
Exactly. The 2 Exorcist sequences are pretty good, but neither of them have just the visceral attack of the first one.
No. They're doing very different things.
And Jaws is another instance. They've never come up with a Jaws sequel. Even when they don't call it Jaws, it's so like I think what the problem is with Jaws, why they've never made a good sequel, is because when you analyze the original Jaws, it doesn't look like a shark at all.
That's true.
But it's terrifying. Well, it doesn't matter that it's just some awful thing that comes and bites people.
Right. And I think part of that is that practical effect and the fact that it wasn't working well. And so they do, kind of going back to The Haunting, it's what you don't see and your brain will fill it in and it makes it scary. Whereas now they can do so much with CGI and you just see it and it's not scary.
Yeah, I mean, it's always the problem. Always, I don't think I bring Tony on into Candyman until 45 minutes into the movie. It's after the halfway point.
Yeah, he has the late entrance that has this, but the impact of that moment is just.
I don't think you see the shark in Jaws until over halfway through.
Yeah, I think that's true.
But that's because it didn't work. Whereas Tony Todd works.
He works.
Once you bring him on, you're not frightened anymore. You're seduced. So the movie, by definition, has to alter its kind of chemistry. And the problem is, the moment you make a sequel, you can't wait 45 minutes to bring them on because they're going, we paid to see it. Where is it? And it's the same thing with Jaws. They're going, where's the shark? They want to see it right away. Or they're going to ask for their money back. And so it's really, really, really hard. In The Exorcist, the whole point about The Exorcist is you never see the bad guy. You only see the effect on the little girl.
Right.
There's like a couple of flash frames of Pazuzu, but it's not even that. It's just a couple of flash frames. I don't think that's meant to be him, is it? I don't know.
I don't know. I think it's left unclear, which is always better, right?
That's always what's great. And and again, I hate it when they tinker with these things. Like the recut of The Exorcist is definitely not an improvement.
No.
The original is perfect. It's literally perfect.
It's hard when they remake a movie that is so impactful and well done the first time around. It's going to be a disappointment. And
yeah, it's like tinkering with things. Like I was doing with Tony Richmond, we were doing the 4K transfer and UHD thing a while back, relatively recently actually, and the temptation is to go, oh, maybe we should do this to that, fix this. Just don't fix anything. Maybe that's the thing that works. The thing that you think is wrong. You don't know what it is that's actually working sometimes.
Yeah, I just wanted to play the clip of Candyman's first appearance. We're nearing the end of our time now, but the thing that I love about it is that it's in broad daylight and it's in a scene when you're not expecting anything to happen.
Yes.
Helen.
Yes?
Helen.
Who is that?
Yeah. And I just wanted to yes.
Amazing costume design.
Yeah, it was done by a man called Leonard Pollock. The idea was that he was supposed to be dressed to go to the opera.
It's so stunning on his frame, like it just accentuates. Perfect.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to leave our viewers with that to tantalize them and perhaps encourage them to rewatch Candyman after this live stream. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I do want to thank you, Bernard, for spending so much of your time with us. It's been an absolute blast.
And it was very exciting when Tony turned up in the middle of
it was.
Right.
Was it 45 minutes in? That's what we need to figure out.
Yes.
Something like that.
That would be absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm going to play the outro bumper, but if you could hang on just for a second in the green room, Bernard, so we can thank you, that would be great. For Iconicon viewers, the next thing coming up is a premiere from Lio Convoy's reviews on Beast Wars, so hang around for that. And later on tonight, Melinda and I, with Dan, will be talking about another sequel that didn't work out so well, Highlander 2. So hang on.
Also starring Virginia Madsen.
Virginia Madsen, exactly.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
Oh dear. Okay, we're going to leave you now, but thanks very much for watching, everyone.